Hey kids, you ever wondered what VTEC sounds like at idle? Yeah, that's it. Not all that exciting. Welcome back, kids. Today we're talking about VTEC, also known by its industry name as variable valve lift. We'll also be taking a look at variable valve timing, and we'll dive into how the two interact with each other. I'm hoping to answer some common questions about these bad boys, such as, what if VTEC was always on? When VTEC kicks in, we get tons of power, so why not have it on all the time so we'll always have more power? Seems easy, right? Well, we're about to find out. So VVL and VVT are two very different things. So let's start by talking about what each one of them does. Variable valve lift, also known as VVL, or what Honda calls VTEC, is a technology that effectively lets you have two camshafts within one. Let's take a step back to break this down in a simpler way. Imagine, for a moment, that you are building a performance engine. One of the things you're likely to upgrade is your camshafts. Now you can typically choose between a number of cams that give you a number of different cam profiles, and each profile has different characteristics. One cam profile might give you more power down at the lower RPMs, maybe at the cost of some more power up top. Another cam profile might do the opposite, where you might lose some power down low, but up at the higher RPMs you'll get more power. At the end of the day though, the cam you choose is generally a compromise somewhere. For example, you've probably heard those big V8s with that glorious choppy idle that sounds like someone dragging a shovel down the driveway. Oh yeah, that's the stuff. That cam is a compromise. That iconic idle is actually the engine running like shit. Down low, such as at cruise or idle, it's not going to perform nearly as well as at the higher RPMs. But we picked that cam, so now we're stuck with it. Unless, of course, we change the cam out to one that performs better down low, but then you'll lose out on that top end. It's a cruel twist of fate. But what if we could somehow have both the cams? And we could switch between them while the engine was running whenever we want. So when we're in the lower RPMs, we can use the low cam, but once we hit, say, 5,000 RPM, we can use the high cam. And that's exactly what VVL, or VTEC, does. Your camshaft literally has two different cam profiles on it, called the low cam and the high cam. And you can switch between them whenever you see fit. It's just a simple matter of tuning that in the ECU. Now, if you're curious about the mechanics of all this, look up videos about how VTEC works because it's actually pretty interesting. Now, what really matters to us is that we can switch between the two profiles. One that's more performance in the lower RPMs and one that's more performance in the higher RPMs. How we can actually do this is by tuning the ECU to switch over at a certain RPM, such as when we're greater than 5,000, for example. Now, one little note. Upgrading your cams with aftermarket ones will almost certainly gain you more power than anything we talk about in this video. I'm only using the cam replacement analogy as an example. No amount of VTEC or VVT tuning is going to replace a good old performance ground cam. But that doesn't mean we can't tune what we already got. And that's the basics of VVL. Now, let's change topics and talk about VVT. Variable valve timing, or VVT, is a technology that lets you advance or retard the position of the camshaft relative to the crankshaft. In a normal engine, the cam position is directly coupled to the position of the crankshaft, usually with a timing belt or timing chain. The way VVT functions is actually quite similar to how these adjustable cam gears work. These here allow you to advance or retard both the intake and exhaust cams. To oversimplify, doing so can allow you to move your power band around, such as having more power down low, or maybe more power up high, amongst other things. The problem with these is that they can't be adjusted while the engine is running, obviously. Once you pick your settings, you're stuck with them until you decide to change them again. This is where VVT comes in. You can do the same thing as those adjustable cam gears, but you can do it while your engine is running simply by editing the tune in your ECU. As an example, you could tell your ECU to set your intake cam advance to 10 degrees in the low RPMs and then slowly move to 0 degrees at redline. So to compare the two, VVL is either on or off, while VVT lets you adjust through a range of cam angle. But this leaves us with a few questions. How do we know at which RPM to turn on VVL? And how do I know which cam angle is the best for a given range of RPMs? Well, using the power of technology, we're about to find out. Now, first things first, let's take a look at the car we're going to be experimenting with. This is a 99 Subaru Legacy. I recently swapped a 6-cylinder Subaru Boxer engine into it, and this specific engine, called the EZ30R, has both VVL and VVT. Yes, my Subaru has VTEC. Or, as Subaru calls it, Active Valve Lift System. But I'm gonna keep calling it VTEC to upset all the Honda boys out there. This thing is basically a J series that somebody dropped on its heads. It also has VVT, or Active Valve Control System, as Subaru brands it, but it's only on the intake cams. But that's still something for us to play with and potentially make some more power with if we tune it right. Now, as with any performance tuning, our goal is to get as much air into the cylinders as possible. The more air we get in, the more power we can make. This is the main reason things like turbo and superchargers work. They force more air mass into the cylinders so you can inject more fuel, so you can get a more powerful ignition, thus making more horsepower. And the same thing goes with cams. If you can get a more aggressive camshaft that lets more air in, or in our case, tune our cams with VVL and VVT so they let more air in, we can get more horsepower. And therein lies a problem. I'm going to be making changes to both the VVL and VVT tunes that theoretically let us gain more power. But how do we know if we're actually making more power? We need a way to measure if the changes we're doing to the cams are making more power, or maybe even making less power. And sure, we could try to take it for a drive and try to feel if we're making more power, but that just isn't accurate enough. We need real quantifiable numbers. And this is where a dyno typically comes in. Normally, you'd do a pull on the dyno, usually from like 2,000 RPM to redline, 7,000 in this case. Then you'd make some changes, do another pull, again 2K to 7K, and then compare the graphs from both of those pulls. If you made more power, awesome, try to improve on that. If not, try some other changes. Maybe you could turn VTEC on earlier, or advance the intake cam more, do some trial and error. Whatever we can do to get more of that air mass into the cylinders to make more power. One minor little problem. I don't own a dyno. Yet, and renting dyno time is expensive. If only there was a way for us to measure that mass of air flowing into the engine. To measure that mass of airflow. That mass airflow. Mass airflow. Mass airflow. Mass airflow. Introducing the mass airflow sensor. This little bad boy is what's responsible for literally running your entire engine. His job is to measure the amount of air going into the engine so the ECU can inject the proper amount of fuel so your engine gets a nice, clean, stoic ignition. Don't know what stoic means? Well, I made an entire video about that, so go watch it. You ever had an intake leak on a car with one of these? It runs like shit, because that air got by this little guy, so he didn't know about that air, so the ECU didn't know to inject additional fuel, then the car runs lean and sounds like shit. It's not his fault that you botched your cold air intake. Now, I have a whole video that features this little guy, so if you're curious about how this stuff works, go take a peek at that. So, although we can't get a power reading because we don't have a dyno, we can get a pretty accurate reading of how much air is going into the engine. And, as we know, the more air we can get, the more power we can make. So, we can just graph what the mass airflow sensor is reading. Similar to the dyno, we'll do a pull, make some changes, do another pull, then compare the graphs to see if what we did helped us get more air, and thus more power, or maybe caused us to get less air, and thus less power. Alright, enough talking. Let's go for a rip. Okay, here's the graph for our pull. On the x-axis here, we have RPM, and on the y-axis, we have airflow in grams of air per second. This is our baseline pull. This is with no VTEC and 0 degrees of intake cam advance for the whole run. In other words, I haven't tuned anything yet. As stated before, we start at around 2,000 RPM and go all the way up to 7,000 RPM. Now, while the actual numbers for airflow don't mean a whole lot, the shape of the graph certainly does. You can see it picking up pretty good here in the low to mid range, but then it starts to taper off as we get into the higher revs. And indeed, when doing the pull, I could feel that there really wasn't much to be had up top. There just wasn't a whole lot of power up there. Now, let's answer our all-important question. What happens if we have VTEC on all the time? Let's find out. One quick note, listen to the difference between the two pulls. They sound entirely different, and I'm sure there's a reason for that. So here's the poll, and this one has VTEC on for the entire time, and again, with 0 degrees of intake cam advance. One thing I notice is how in the lower RPMs, things sorta kinda curve a little bit more, but up at the higher RPMs, we don't taper off, we kinda keep going up. And indeed, this thing feels a lot faster up at those higher RPMs. Now, I want to say that I felt that it wasn't pulling as hard down low, but I can't say for certain. The old butt dyno just ain't all that accurate. But what is accurate is our data. And things start to become real obvious when we overlay those two poles on top of each other. And here we are. The blue is the no VTEC pole, and the green is the VTEC pole. And the difference is obvious. Down low here, having VTEC off is clearly letting the engine breathe more, meaning it makes more power without VTEC. Which makes sense if you think about it. It is called the high cam profile for a reason, meaning it's meant for those higher RPMs. Same for the low cam, which is clearly producing more power down low. However, and this is the important part, when we hit about 5200, having VTEC on makes the engine start breathing substantially more in those higher RPMs. And it is a night and day difference when you're driving the car. So, just from those two polls and those two data logs, we already answered two very important questions. Number one, what happens if we have VTEC on all the time? The answer is, we lose a good bit of power down low here, but up top it sings. And number two, when should we turn on VTEC? It looks to be around 5200 RPM. And there you go. Now, obviously, these results are not only just for this engine, but for this specific build. I have a pretty free-flowing exhaust and some custom headers that I boogered together in the previous video, so the results will more than likely be different for the setup that you're running. Now, we've just covered tuning VVL, or VTEC. What about VVT, or variable valve timing? As stated before, VVT lets you adjust your cam's position in relation to the crankshaft. While some engines have VVT on both the intake and exhaust cams, this specific engine only has it on the intake cams. Now, this engine happens to have an adjustment range of 0 to 50 degrees of intake cam advance. Unlike VTEC, which is either on or off, VVT lets us choose anywhere between those 0 and 50 degrees. So how do we know which angle is going to get us the most power? And the answer is by doing some polls and analyzing the data. Now I can't very well do 50 different polls at all 50 degrees, so instead I'm going to do 5. One at 0 degrees, one at 12 degrees, 25, 37, and 50. I'm just splitting that 50 degree range into fifths. Now, ideally, we can overlay the graphs on top of each other to see where we're getting the most power with what angle. So, here we go with those polls. Alright, let's go ahead and pull up those graphs. Now, isn't this interesting? Now, what I'm focusing on is the very top of all of these lines, this primary curve that all of them join together to make. Now, down in the lower RPMs here, things are pretty close. But I do see this yellow line as being a smidge higher than the rest of them. And that one is our 25 degree pole. So that says to me that we should be at 25 degrees down low to get the most power. But the mid to high RPMs tell an entirely different story. Like, wow, what a gorgeous graph. Now what's interesting is that our worst performer is the 50 degree pole, which is the one that is maximum advanced. And our best performer is the 0 degree pole. Now remember, these numbers are in intake cam advance, meaning the higher the number, the higher the lobe separation angle, or the LSA. The lower the number, the lower the LSA. A lower lobe separation angle tends to increase power at higher RPM because it allows for more valve overlap, or the time when both the intake or exhaust valves are open simultaneously. This promotes better scavenging of exhaust gases, meaning we get more air into the cylinders, and we can clearly see that in this graph. If you want to know more about things like LSA, watch some videos on how to choose a performance cam, as that knowledge is directly applicable to these concepts. Now up high, our best performing pole was the one where we were at 0 degrees, meaning the least LSA. Each pole then progressively gets worse until we're maxed out at 50 degrees. There is a 30% difference between our 0 and 50 degree pole, which is just staggering. We can also see that down low, 25 degrees tends to make the most power, but around 3500, that's when the 0 degree pole starts to take over. So we can basically ignore these other graphs. And that right there tells me how I should tune my VVT. We'll start out at 25 degrees, and then around that 3500 RPM area, we'll move back towards 0 degrees in order to chase this upper curve. So, theoretically, if I were to put that tune on and do a poll, we'd see a nice single line that follows the tops of both of these graphs, that rides along the top of the curves. So, let's do just that. We'll put the tune on and go for a poll. And here's our final result. Let's go ahead and add back the previous two lines. As you can see, we start out by following this yellow line, even making a bit more than it. Then we taper off and follow that blue 0 degree line. We're riding on top of those curves, just as we intended to. I love it when a plan comes together. Alright, there you have it. We've just tuned our VVT for max power. Or have we? We're forgetting one little thing, aren't we? VTEC. For these 5 pulls that we just looked at, VTEC was off. And remember, VTEC works by having 2 cam profiles on a single cam. The low cam and the high cam. Turning it on is effectively like installing a whole new cam. So it stands to reason that our VVT will behave entirely differently with VTEC on when we're using those high cam lobes. So what does this mean? Well, it means I gotta do yet another 5 pulls. Just like before though, a pull at 0 degrees, 12 degrees, 25, 37, and 50 degrees. This time with VTEC on. We'll do exactly what we did before, which is overlay all of them on top of each other and do a comparison. Here we go again. Okay, so here they are. And wow, are they different than the last set we looked at. Now, as a reminder, we're still doing pulls from about 2,000 to 7,000 RPM, increasing our cam advance angle with each pull, but this time we have VTEC on. So the first thing I see is that this 50 degree pull is making power up until around 4,500-ish. Now this is in stark contrast to our previous no VTEC pulls, where early on we got a bit more power with 25 degrees, which tapered off around 3,500 RPM. Now at this 4,500 RPM area, we can see that this red line takes over, which is our 37 degree pull. But that's only until around 5,500-ish, at which point our 0 degree pull takes over, just like before. Which again makes sense because that lobe separation angle is getting smaller and smaller. So, just like before, I can just tune my ECU for this. I can tell it to maintain 50 degrees until 4,500 RPM, taper that off to 37 degrees at 5,500 RPM, and then down to 0 for the remainder. Easy. And just like before, we can do a pull with our new VVT tune, this time with VTEC on. We should, again, get a line that rides the top of the curves, just like before. And here's that pull, overlaid, riding the top of those curves, just as promised. Isn't that just wonderful? So, now we've tuned our VVT for both low cam and high cam. Earlier in the video, we compared these two pulls, low cam versus high cam. Both of these pulls were at 0 degrees of VVT because we hadn't tuned it yet. Now that we have tuned it for both low cam and high cam, let's compare them once more, just like before. Only this time we're not stuck at 0 degrees, we're following the curves for both. Okay, just like before, the blue line is for the no VTEC pull, and the green line is for the VTEC pull. Wow, look at that. Down low, they are quite close. Heck, we could turn VTEC on at like 3,500 RPM, as compared to before when we were going to turn it on around 5,200 RPM. Now there is one thing to note here. Technically, we will need to have 2 VVT tunes. One for the low cam and one for the high cam. Now with my standalone ECU, I can actually do this just fine, using this little switch down here. See, here's our tune from before for the low cam, and here's our tune for the high cam. The ECU will switch between them depending on if we're using the low cam or high cam at the time, which is pretty neat. So here's what I think I'm going to do for the final tune. I'm going to set VTEC to turn on around 3,500 RPM, right here where it starts to pick up. Then I'm going to do a pull. Ideally, we'll follow the tops of the curves of both of these lines, just like before. Alright, let's give it a shot. Okay, here's our final tuned pull, where VTEC automatically turns on at 3,500 RPM. And just like before, it's riding the tops of those curves. Isn't that just the coolest damn thing? There is this little dip right here, which is pretty interesting. Remember when I said the ECU would switch between the VVT tunes based on if VTEC was on or off? This here is when VTEC turns on, at 3,500 as we said before. This dips is the cams trying to advance, to catch up when it switches VVT tunes, which takes a little bit of time. It just so happens that on the low cam tune, we're only requesting about 12 degrees of advance at 3,500, but the high cam tune is requesting 50 degrees at 3,500. So when VTEC comes on at 3,500, the cams have to move from 12 degrees to 50 degrees, which takes a little bit of time, and we can see it as a dip in this airflow graph, which is really cool. I could even feel a little brief bit of hesitation when it happens. Alright, let's do some wrap up. The tune I'd been driving on was this, with no VTEC and VVT. And through our process of data logging, graphing, and analyzing, we crafted a tune that made this. And while we did gain a tiny bit down low here, where things really started to shine is up top, and it honestly feels like a whole different car. It's quite noticeably quicker. One cool thing I found was when doing this pull here, where I set VTEC to come on late at like 6,000 RPM. This is the kind of tune that Honda guys love because when VTEC comes on, it kicks like a mule, and we can see why. We get this big jump of power. However, we can also see something very important. We're missing out on all this power here. So if you feel a hard VTEC engagement, that probably means your VTEC tune is shit and you're missing out on some power. Sorry to rain on your parade, Honda boys. Get your laptop out and get to work. Going into this, I had some assumptions. I kinda guessed that VTEC would lose us power down low and give us more up high. I mean, that's what it's designed to do. And that's what we ended up discovering with the first few graphs we looked at. What I didn't expect is how very little VVT would do for us. Sure, we got a bit more power down low here, but it's still real close to that 0 degree tune. In fact, in most of the polls, when we tried to make changes, the only thing VVT could do was hurt our performance. Like in these graphs here. These are the pulls we did with no VTEC while stepping up our VVT angle. Down low, there just isn't really much to be had by advancing it. And up top, it still makes sense to leave it at 0 degrees, which is the default. I had assumed that increasing the intake cam advance, thus increasing our lobe separation angle, would net us more power down low, but that just isn't the case. And after a bit of research, this actually tends to make sense. While VTEC, or VVL, is typically used to improve performance, VVT is usually used to improve on emissions. And while that's probably not true for all engines, it certainly is for this one. Since the effect that VVT has is so small, I could modify the tune so I don't rely on it at all and run purely on VTEC. This would get rid of that small dip in power we saw earlier. But for now, I'm happy, so I think I'm gonna leave it as is. Okay, so my next task is to get this bad boy running on E85, so be sure to subscribe to see more about that. I also have plans to do some sort of forced induction on this build, but I'm still working through exactly what I want to do. As always, if you have any questions or comments, drop them below. I love hearing from you guys, and I try to answer any questions that come up. And thanks a ton for all the recent support you've all shown. I am truly humbled. I put a good amount of effort into these videos, sometimes more than I probably should. For example, the graphs that we were looking at earlier were actually generated by a program that I wrote solely for this video. Subscribing and liking the video can greatly help with boosting the video and this channel in the rankings, which helps justify the truly obscene amount of time and money that I invest in this hobby. Alright, time to go upgrade a fuel pump. Thank you all for watching. Bye for now.